minute to load everything. Because I use a Restream service where OBS. Do you guys use OBS?
No.
I use OBS because it sends it to a Restream website, which sends it to YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and several other sites all at the same time, which is really cool.
Well, that's nice. Less work for you. Does
Yeah.
it cost anything?
Nope, totally free.
No. Gosh, I need to hang out with you more. You figure stuff like this out. Do my heavy lifting for me.
Absolutely. Happy to help. Let's see here. Wait for the
Yeah,
chat.
if
Make
if
sure.
um if you hear like a little bit of banging in the background, it's absolutely unavoidable today. We have a guy working outside on a window, but I think he's pretty much done. But you might hear a hammer, but it will be faint because the window's closed. So hopefully your day won't be ruined by a bang or two.
Yeah, it doesn't sound too bad. I can barely hear it.
Yeah, it's not going now, but yeah, so I think it'll be all right.
All right,
Just
so
so you're not alarmed, and I think it gives a real homey kind of feel. Like we're just a couple guys hanging out and stuff. We
yeah,
should have a beer in our hands too.
yeah, totally. So Pete,
Yeah.
anyway, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, sure. Well, I teach in the Department of Theology at Eastern University, which is outside of Philadelphia, and I've been there for a few years, and I taught seminary level as well for about 14 years before that. And yeah, I'm a biblical scholar by training. I like to dabble in other things as well, but so yeah, and I teach courses essentially on biblical literature at the college level as I did in the seminary level, and I have a podcast and I write some books occasionally and do podcasts as guests. And now this is the first time I'm actually doing something via video, so it's very cool. By the way, Tom, you have the best chair on the internet. That thing's a really amazingly comfortable thing you've got going on.
Yeah, thank you. I actually get that a lot. That's like one of my tropes is that everyone comments about my chair.
I
Uh,
know it's pretty cool. Yeah.
so would you tell us about your podcast? What is the link to it for anyone who's interested in checking it out?
It's easiest just to get to through my website, which is PeteEnns.com, but it's called the Bible for Normal People. And basically, the gist of it is to sort of popularize critical approaches to scripture for people who are more or less coming out of sort of a conservatism that it just doesn't work for them anymore intellectually. And so they're looking for other paradigms, other ways of approaching this stuff. And so that's a lot of fun to do. I like popularizing things that can get a little bit complicated, in the world of biblical scholarship. It's fun to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's kind of like what I do, pretty much.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah.
So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there are any reasons to believe in the existence of God. Could you tell me what reasons you believe there are for belief in God? And then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, I mean, the question is one that, I mean, I ask myself that question a lot too. So let me just start with that. And when I think of reasons, I'm not really sure what reasons there are to believe in God. And in terms of the way I think we typically think of reasoning, which I respect, logic, evidence, analysis, things like that. So, I wind up deconstructing that question for myself a lot and just saying, if God exists, for example, right? And I think this way to myself all the time. If God exists, is that the way to approach whether God exists or not, and even what we mean by God existing to begin with? I think it's a very complicated thing. So, I'm very content to sort of kick ideas around on that, but I'm not an apologist. I don't think in terms of here are the reasons why I believe, and I'll now pass this on to you, and you will now have reasons to believe too. I think that the issue, again, if there is a God, I think it's deeper, it's more subtle than that. And I don't think if God exists, if this universe is is the work of a creator, let's say, I don't know if I can give here are the three reasons why I believe in God. To me, that becomes rather nonsensical for me at that point. I do have reasons that are other reasons. I mean, they're experiential reasons. They're community-oriented reasons. There are moments I've had in my life that I might call God moments, not very many of them. But, I've chosen to stay in that stream, so to speak, and to keep nurturing this faith that I have certain convictions about at times, and other times I'm a thoroughly agnostic Christian. I really just don't know. And I have to say, at my age, I'm rather comfortable with that position because it just gets me out of a lot of really bad conversations I sometimes have with Christians who demand a certain way of thinking logically about the nature of God. And I think all of our talk about God is, by definition, incomplete and partial and always ready for deconstruction anyway.
Yeah, that's
So
probably
that's me in a nutshell.
yeah, that's one of the most reasonable positions I've heard, or from that I agree with. I think pretty much everything you said for the most part. I can't think of anything I disagree with there. Would you classify yourself as a fideist then?
um, and I think fideism is too strictly intellectual a category, if I'm understanding it correctly. I mean, I do use my mind. I just like to put my mind on vacation. And it's actually, that's what drives me sometimes to think of things the way I just expressed it, and I think, not to get off topic here, but being someone trained in critical biblical scholarship, you can see the holes pretty quickly in how sometimes people argue about this stuff. And that has driven me into, I mean, over the years, in ways that it's so hard for me to articulate, it's driven me to what I'd say is more of a contemplative approach to the Christian faith, or an apophatic approach to the Christian faith, where my words are not the most important thing that can be said. And sometimes my actions mean more. Well, my actions always mean more than my words, because actions affect people in different ways.
What do you mean by
So,
contemplative and apoplectic?
hmm?
What do you mean by contemplative? Contemplative Christianity?
Contemplative is I mean, it's actually sort of a quick rubric for a lot of different things, but a contemplative approach is one that accepts the transrational nature of faith, let's put it that way. And, like, for example, prayer is oftentimes being silent, meditative, and not conjuring up words, which are just our ways to control reality. And if God exists, about the last thing I want to try to do is control God with my words. But I have to use words because I'm a human being, so you hold them with humility. And um, I have beliefs that which are open to negotiation. I can't be a human being any other way. And if God exists, God understands that, and God is fine with me, the way I am. And because I'm not trying to be a smartass, I'm just trying to be a human being, trying to figure out my existence here. So yeah, contemplative is something. I mean, for example, a monastic way of living, which I'm not a monk by any stretch of the imagination, but it is about just retreating from the fray and silence, really. Silence for me is not an easy thing because I'm a scholar and a professor, and all I do is talk, right? So for me, that's been an important spiritual discipline to begin to think differently about what it means to believe in God and to be in communion with God.
Yeah, that seems totally reasonable to me. Do you think there are any of the arguments or evidence that are presented in apologetics that are interesting, even though they may not be especially compelling to you?
Um, Honestly, no. And I might listen to, in other words, see if people, the ontological argument or something, I forgot. I'll listen. I mean, there might be something there, but for me, it's still children playing with something that is far beyond our capacity to imagine, let alone understand. Again, if God is real, you know what I mean? It's like, I just need to shut up every once in a while and not think like I can wrap my arms around this. And that's why, for some, see, I think for some people, um, it can be a helpful exercise, that kind of an apologetic. But for me, it never has been, and it's not now. Because all those things there's always an argument against all these arguments. There's always something convincing that people haven't thought about. And then you just keep turning around the circularity of reasoning. And And to me, that's exactly the signal of the inadequacy of those arguments for proving anything, because you're sort of lumped back into um, a self-referential kind of argument that I just think, again, if God exists, it has to be more than that. It has to be different. And I think, back to contemplative, the contemplative way of thinking. Richard Rohr is a name you might know. I don't know. He's I like Richard Rohr a lot. I've learned a lot from him. But he's got this analogy of a tricycle, which is sort of like a model for maybe theological knowledge or for the nature of faith. It's three wheels. The back two wheels are scripture and tradition. The front wheel is your experience, which includes your reasoning. And he says, don't kid yourself. Your experience drives everything. And I've embraced that. I'm aware of that. And I know other people haven't had my experiences, and I don't expect them to think about things the way I might think about them. And I have no, unlike some people who might do apologetics, I just have no fear of that. I have no concern like the other is beneath me because they're not thinking the same way that I am. I think God, if God exists, is big enough to handle all this. We're really just trying to be authentic, for heaven's sake. And that has to count for something, and not just playing a game and having a better argument and winning a debate. I have no patience with that. And then, debating is all about, I have to be right or I look dumb. It's just, okay, that's what we're doing here. That's what this is all about. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. That's
Maybe I'm
my
the wrong person to talk to, Tom. I don't know, but I just,
No, no, I
I
agree with
just,
everything you're saying because my main argument against the apologetics is that we don't really know what the fundamental nature of reality is, and we're trying to use arguments or evidence that we come up with to describe the absolute truths, which we just don't have access to. You can always disprove those by using essentially the same arguments and mirroring them for an alternative conclusion. That's essentially my strategy, is just to say, well,
yeah,
anything you can say for theism, I can say for naturalistic pantheism because we
right.
don't know anything about the fundamental nature of reality.
Exactly right. And I can put myself in the place of an apologist, and I might, if I were into that sort of thing at all, I would say, yeah, you're probably right. Isn't that interesting? We can both use the same arguments. They don't necessarily cancel each other out, but maybe maybe there's something Christians have to learn from the negative, from the pushback, from the um, exposing the limitations of a rational mind for talking about ultimate reality. I mean, I'm all over that because the universe scares the daylights out of me in a sense. It's for all intents and purposes literally infinite. There are at least 100 billion stars in our galaxy. I counted once. If you counted 1 second for each star, it would take you, I think, 11 and a half days to count to a million. It would take you 32 years to count to a billion. It would take you 3,200 years to count the stars in our galaxy. That's one galaxy, and we can't even get to the closest star ever. It's just not going to happen, right? So what do I have to add to this conversation about ultimate reality? I mean, we understand so much about the universe through science, but not everything, obviously. And sometimes what we're finding is more mystery heaped upon mystery. And I just think, to me, that's, if we're going to talk about the fundamental nature of reality, I think we have to talk mystery at some level, and such a quantity of potential knowledge that we can't possibly master it. Now, if you're going to throw God into this mix, how can you think of God as any smaller than that? Right? So,
Yeah.
and I choose not to, because it makes absolutely, it would drive me crazy if I started thinking like that.
Right.
So I'm happy just to let it all go.
I tend to
Yeah,
agree with the Thomas Edison quote that we only know 1/1,000,000% of anything. And science tends
yeah,
to always keep things tentative and provisional and never put ultimate answers or to the ultimate questions, give answers to the ultimate questions. And that, I think, is
right,
the greatest advantage to the scientific approach as opposed to apologetics, which tends to try to make these ultimate answers, which are just, to me, seem so ridiculous because we obviously can't make those kinds of claims. Like, not even the greatest forms of knowledge, science, can even come close to that. So it seems
right,
really ridiculous to try and claim that we can know something about the ultimate realm of reality when we only know 1/1,000,000% of anything.
right. And the scientific method is, it's the proper method for trying to discover some of those things in physical reality. It's not the proper method for figuring out, does God exist? Again, that's even metaphorical language right there. What does it mean to exist and for God to do it? And I do tend to embrace contemplative kind of language and Eastern Orthodox language that maybe God is existence, maybe God is the ground of being, maybe God is being. I don't know what I just said. I have don't ask me to defend that. I can't possibly do it, but I'm grasping for some language to express what I've experienced, but without feeling the pressure of having to align my ability to understand with that experience itself. And that too, anybody could say that, right?
Yep.
Anyone in faith can say that. I get absolutely fine, you know. And what's the worst that can happen if God exists? God understands that too, and how, you know, if I were born in a different time and place, I wouldn't be Christian. I don't know what I would be. Who knows? I mean, if I were born in another continent, another time. And again, if God exists, I cannot imagine a God who would be vindictive or retributional, for example, because of that set of affairs, right? So, and I'm not the first person to say that. People have been saying that in the Christian faith for pretty much since the beginning, these strands of it. And it part of my own process, my own spiritual formation, as we call it, has been getting into some communication with traditions beyond, you know, evangelicalism or some form of biblicism, right? So, and that's sort of nice to know. The Christian faith is actually fairly broad. It's not as narrow as, let's say, the discipline of apologetics can sometimes make it out to be.
So would you say that you said God wouldn't punish us for admitting that we don't know things? Would that include like letting atheists into heaven or something?
Well, I think we're still talking metaphor. We're always going to be talking metaphorically about God, but um, don't get me started on what I don't know about heaven, right? I mean, um, is there physicality, or is it the continuation of consciousness? Is it another dimension? Is it a parallel universe? I mean, I have no idea, but I don't think it's about getting into heaven. I think it's about being in God's presence. And I do believe that if God exists, and if God is love, and if God is true strength and power, all will be redeemed. You know, and they might not use the language that I use, but I believe that I can't, I don't know what other conclusion I can come to. If I mean, I haven't read David Bentley Hart's latest book on Christian and universalism, and I probably won't because it's probably very long and complicated. I'll leave that to you. But um, I've read enough about what he says to say, well, I mean, to me, that's an interesting thing to think about, the way he talks about. And of course, again, he has Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox sensibilities, and he's not remotely Baptist or Calvinist or evangelical or fundamentalist. He has a whole different paradigm for thinking about this stuff that respects mystery too. So,
So from my perspective, the reason I don't believe in God is mostly because of like the problem of suffering. For me, it seems like if it
right,
really was an all good, all powerful God, he could have created a world without involuntary suffering. He could have made it optional. Like he could have
right.
just given us the option to go to world A as designed by God with the suffering, or world B that doesn't have the suffering. And I seem like that would have been a more moral way to do things. And so forcing us to be in this world without our consent seems to be horribly immoral and contradictory to the nature of God as described in the Bible.
Yeah, and I think no matter how many people claim to have solved the problem of evil and suffering, I don't think it's been solved. And um, I'm thinking here just on the top of my, just on my feet here, but I keep coming back to that, and I don't know if there's a bigger problem. So I think we would agree that this is a serious problem. I don't have an answer for it. What I do think about though, and I could be wrong about this. Maybe some of people watching this will know better than I do, but um, I don't know of another faith that somehow claims that God participates in shameful suffering, and that is the Christian faith. That is New Testament theologians talk about how if you're going to start a religion in the first century in the Greco-Roman world with an honor shame culture, you don't align your God with Roman crucifixion in any way, shape, or form. And yet, that's such a powerful thing in the New Testament that we are participating in Christ's suffering, he participates in ours. And somehow that's going to work itself out towards something big and beautiful. That doesn't prove a single thing. That's not an apologetic for the Christian faith. I just find it really interesting that, that's why Paul says, for example, in Romans, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God for salvation for all who believe, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. Very contextual, Jew and Gentile, right? It's a very first century thing to say. But, why would he say I'm not ashamed? And when I was younger, I was always taught like that means don't be afraid to witness to people on the lunch line at school. Tell them about Jesus. Don't be afraid. Paul's not saying I'm not afraid to talk about Jesus. He goes, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why would he be ashamed? Look at how it started. It started with the overturning of the honor shame dynamic. It started with the overturning of the Beatitudes. The blessed are the poor. Those who are the lower, they're the ones who are blessed. And to me, I guess what I'm getting at is the paradox of the Christian faith, which I think is very fundamental to it, is just enough to keep me saying, "Wow, I wouldn't have thought of this actually as a faith system, let's call it." And it's very attractive to me. I don't mind telling you that the irrationality of it. I'm sounding like Kierkegaard now or something, but the irrationality of it to me is very attractive because all the other stuff, it's just you're propping up these pieces to make it all fit. And I think the pieces just come tumbling down when confronted with the cross. Now, that's a statement of faith on my part. That's not a reasoned argument. I'm not going to convince anybody with that, but it's just something to think about for me. It makes so little sense that this is how this faith would start. Now, it could be, for example, of course, this isn't, I can deconstruct all this stuff all day if I want to, but it could just be that the New Testament writers are grasping at something to make sense of Jesus's death, right? And this is just telling us what they might believe in a desperate moment. Yeah, I mean, that's a possible scenario. I can't say that's impossible to think that way. So, I'd want to think more about that. And again, I do think about that internally. I have these conversations I'm having a great conversation by myself right now, right? I think about this stuff a lot. And but yeah, anyway,
Yeah, I think that's a
all
really
that being
interesting
said.
topic. I think about that too all the time. Like one of my friends, Doug, who has another YouTube channel, he brought up the topic like, why was this whole crucifixion thing necessary? I mean, if it's just a bag of meat essentially, and if we're just sacrificing a bag of meat on a cross, and really the soul is what matters because we're all souls, why is the sacrificing a bag of meat necessary? And why was the cross necessary? Could Jesus like tripped and fallen and broken his neck, and would that have counted? Like, what is?
I know, right? Like he could have been run over by a chariot. Like why die this way? I think, and again, I'm pretty convinced this is the answer to that. Although again, I want to be very careful that I'm not proving Christianity when I say this, right? But it is the abject humiliation of that kind of death, which was the purpose of Roman crucifixion. They perfected the art of torture and then stripping people naked, hanging them at pretty much eye level. They weren't like way up in some of those pictures of Easter, of Good Friday, but um, the point of which was to humiliate and discourage and to humble. And I think, in my theological mind, that makes a lot of sense to me in this paradoxical faith, that it's different than being, having arrows shot into your heart while you're tied to a stake or something. It's actually designed to humiliate. And again, assuming the validity of the Christian model for sake of discussion, um, that's a really interesting God we're talking about at this point that participates in that way. But why did Jesus need to die at all? I think that's still a very valid question. I mean, that can be answered internally within the logic of Scripture and of the Christian faith, but to sort of take that outside of that logic, it's it's hard to wrap your head around. Like, why does God need this? And one answer, I mean, again, I think about this stuff, and I don't know if I'm right or not, but I do sometimes think like the New Testament writers. Okay, they believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's easy. That's a wonderful thing to have happen. But why die that way? Why die at all? Well, we're now going to enter into the language of Leviticus and of the Old Testament, of their tradition, which is the only language they have. And I think what we're seeing here is a reasoning process. Well, that death must have meant something, and it must be for the benefit of others. And then when you realize that, I mean, the New Testament writers don't make that up. You see this in Jewish literature of the Second Temple period, like 100 years, 200 years before Christ, where the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs actually atones for the sins of the people as a whole. And uh, even you see this in Second Isaiah, for example, what's called the fourth servant song, like Isaiah 52 and 53, where the servant suffers on behalf of the people. Well, the servant is obviously Judah in exile. It's not one person, it's not Jesus. So you have this notion of the blood of some atoning for the sins of others, but it's still a different thing in the New Testament with Jesus. But my point is that they have language to explain why that had to happen the way that it did. But I might ask, well, that's it. That's like the best plan we have. There's nothing else to think about. And part of my life of faith is actually to ask those questions internally or externally. And again, I'm fine with that. You know, I don't mind saying I can't actually explain the cross. There you go. I can't actually do it. I know the models, I know the paradigms, and they're all interesting, and I play with them. But at the end of the day, the way my brain works, I can't wrap my head around it, and I'm not going to say, well, this is what it means. This is how it works. Especially since the New Testament has different models for what the cross means. It's not just one. It's maybe 6 or 7, depending on who you ask.
What I find really interesting
It's a
is,
mess out there, Tom. It's a mess out there. I'm telling you. Yes.
yeah, I've spent a lot of time researching. I've read the Bible cover to cover multiple times and thinking through it. One of the things I was thinking about is like, why is blood so important? Because the Bible emphasizes how unimportant this world is, how minimal it is, how much our bodies are just from dust and to dust they will go. And so, why
Right.
is it that the sacrificing of this dust for this blood dust is somehow significant in the grander scheme of the universe when all it is just dust?
Right. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think probably the Judeo-Christian, I hate that term, but you know what I mean, like the Old and New Testaments combined. Um, I think there's a little bit of both, because you do have, for example, the biblical writers don't really believe in the immortality of the soul. They believe in the resurrection of the body. They believe in the recreation of all creation. So physicality is very important in that ethic. Um, but still, you know, why blood? And what I've thought for many years is this is just, they're probably not the only ones in the history of humanity that thought this way about the importance of blood. And what we're seeing here is how the biblical story does have roots outside of itself. And if there's anything that we know from the study of other religions of antiquity, there's really nothing you can point to that's absolutely unique in the biblical story itself. And probably blood is one of those things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really trying to think of through all the things that goes on is because it's so, you're right, it is very paradoxical. Because for me, when I look at the Bible, I see a whole bunch of contradictions, and that seems just like a man-made book. You said that's attractive to you in some sense.
It is probably because I had always been taught that it's not contradictory and therefore it's beautiful. You know, so I look at it. What I like about the contradictory nature of the Bible, and it's clearly almost ubiquitously, at least diverse, if not flat out contradictory, is because it's written by people. And people living at different times and different places under different circumstances. You have contradictions within Torah because there are different traditions that are probably separated by, if not generations, if not even centuries. And I just find that a very humanizing, affirming thing that is consistent, let's say, with Christian theology, which has as its core something incarnational. Right. So I think that, again, if God exists, I'm going to stop saying that. I believe God exists, but you know what I mean, that I don't know what I mean by that. Right. Okay, fine. So, you know, I don't think that God is, I don't think a scripture that is contradictory and is sort of moving in certain directions, sometimes different directions at once, and sometimes they're not even reconciled. I don't think a scripture that's so fundamentally human is at all at odds with a book that has been like a non-negotiable partner for both Judaism and Christianity for over 2,000 years. I don't think it has to be one or the other. And that's why things, in terms of apologetics, there's nothing that irritates me more is people trying to smooth over the Bible and making it into something that it's not. There are things that clearly cannot be reconciled. And Jews get this. You see, Christians have a hard time with this, but I think Jews have a much easier time reconciling the fact that there are laws in Torah that say very, very different things that can't be reconciled. You know,
Yeah, I think
that's
that's
what else do you expect from an incarnational God?
well, I think that's why apologetics is so popular, actually, is because when people see these contradictions, it's harder for them to just accept the contradictions and still believe, rather than trying to justify them in their head and come up with some kind of justificatory reason. Like they don't want to just believe on faith. They want to say, no,
Right,
I don't just have faith. I have reasons because science has told us we need reasons. We need these facts and these things for it to be reasonable to
right.
believe. And so apologetics takes up that mantle and says, well, we can give you those reasons, even if they're not really that good.
They're good enough for people for for a time. I don't think they're good enough ultimately, but for some, it's the trauma of going from like I've got it all locked down pretty well until you actually start reading the Bible, and then you can't get past the first two chapters and realize there are two creation stories that are not jiving in any way, shape, or form, right? Um, but I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, Tom. It's something about what they're perceiving about the nature of the life of faith, of the spiritual life, which is it must be in accord to reason. And the irony, and I'm sure you know this, is that that's exactly a modernist foundationalist way of thinking that they're always saying they're against. They're participating in that very same way of thinking. And that's why, the 19th century liberals and the 19th century atheists, they were discussing these things back and forth. They're arguing more or less on the same foundation, I think, that this stuff, bottom line, this stuff has to be reasonable, right? If God does it, it has to be reasonable. And if it's not reasonable, God didn't do it. And fundamentalists say, well, we have to believe in God anyway, so let's make it look reasonable. And I think there's a problem in both of those ways of looking, and it's the assumption that we can adequately express God in language that will never change, will never have to be amended, will never have to be augmented, will never have to be adjusted in any way, shape, or form. Almost like a math formula. Nothing, those things really irritate. You're doing therapy now, Tom. I don't know if you realize that, but it really does irritate me to see people actually disrespect the text so much that they make it all harmonized and say the same thing.
Or
Don't you
try
dare do
to.
that.
They try
Yeah,
to.
well, they try to, exactly, or they assume it should be that way.
Hmm.
And so anyway, as long as those people don't sign my paycheck, I don't really care too much. But because they used to, but I think that's not a perspective of faith. Ironically, I think that's a perspective of fear.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think that people have just gotten so used to science and science being, well, we have good reasons. If you don't have good reasons, you shouldn't believe it. And they just adopted that and applied it to religion as well. And they're just trying to, apologetics is just trying to cope or fit that niche to fill that gap people have emotionally.
And I think our religion will win that debate every time. And it's when I see that, again, it's a shame that people of faith have bought into the paradigm, let's say, and not see again. I come back to this idea of mystery, and life really is a journey. Faith is a journey. It's not something you just hold on to, and that is very frightening for people who have grown up to think, well, no, you need to be certain about what you believe. Well, what if I'm not? You know, there's this line toward the end of Matthew's gospel after resurrection. Jesus is showing himself to people, and there's a line that says, "Yeah, and some people still didn't believe." And he just leaves it there. He doesn't even explain it. It's like you always, I mean, read the Psalms for heaven's sake. Most of them, like they're having a bad day. Things are not working out. Psalm 89 calls God a liar, pretty much, for promising that he would always leave a descendant of David sitting on the throne. And he's been praising God for his fidelity to keeping his promises for like 30 something verses. And he goes, by the way, we talk about the exile where the Davidic line came to a complete end. What kind of a God are you? You know, if your loving kindness is not steadfast, if we can't count on that, maybe we can count on your absence. I love that stuff. You know, this is the real gutsy life of faith where doubt. Let me put it this way: I don't think you can be anything other than an agnostic Christian in an intellectual sense. You can't. You have to admit that. You cannot just lock it all down. The Bible doesn't even lock it all down.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Praise God. I just went evangelical on you. Praise God. You know, it's just I don't know. That's
yeah,
why I don't get bored doing this stuff. You know.
hmm yeah, I mean, listening to you, I like agree with everything you said. It's like the, what's it? Music to my ears. It's like that's it.
Oh,
I agree pretty much with everything you say, and because my entire gripe against apologetics is that they claim to know far more than they can, and I think I totally agree that when you get into those kind of philosophical debates, the A religionists are going to win because it's just saying we don't know ultimate answers, and that's I totally agree with that in every sense. Um,
yeah.
some people in the Q&A asked, could you tell us about some of your experiences that you've had that caused you to believe in God?
Um, let's say that have supported a belief in God. I can't say that it's caused anything, but again, it's hard to reduce this stuff because when you talk about it, it just seems
Oh,
less.
let me
But for me, it's
clarify. I
very
apologize.
meaningful. But
This
yeah,
isn't like a debate question. I'm just, can you tell us about your experiences?
yeah, no, yeah. I'm trying to like. I'm not taking it as a debate question, but it's like I just even when I tell Christian friends about some things, it's like one as soon as you utter it, it becomes less than. But um, I wrote this book called The Sin of Certainty a few years ago, and I relay in that a story regarding my daughter who's going through some very difficult things, anxiety related and panic disorder. And um, I was in a very despondent place for her. And something just sort of bizarre happened to me that for me, I took as confirmation of God's presence, not solving the problem, but more just be at peace. And it has to do with the Live Strong bracelet. Remember Lance Armstrong and those Live Strong bracelets? And
Yep.
this is like 2007 or so. And um, we were going to have her go to a therapeutic boarding school in Arizona. I live in Pennsylvania, so that's very far away. And we didn't know that yet, actually. But I was in Arizona visiting my son who played baseball, and I was watching his baseball stuff for a week. And while I was there, my daughter asked me, she knew she was going to go away someplace. She didn't know where yet. She said, "Can you get me a Livestrong bracelet while you're out there?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll pick one up." They were a big thing. I mean, you buy them in a gas station, for heaven's sake. I couldn't find one anywhere, right? So I was about to call her and say, listen, I don't think I can find one. I'll try to pick it up when I get back. I felt really bad because I wanted to help her. She was in a lot of pain. Anyway, the baseball team gathered at this guy's house. He was a an alumnus, and outside having this big barbecue, and his name was John. And I was standing there talking to him, and he's flipping burgers, and he reaches out his hand to flip a burger. There's a Livestrong bracelet on his wrist. Okay, so I think to myself, he must know where I can get one. And I felt again, I can explain this stuff psychologically in a sense, but for me, the experience was this: I felt an imposition saying, "Ask him if he has one," and I ignored it. I just ignored that. I said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of." So I didn't ask him anything. I just noticed. I said, "Oh, John, you have a Livestrong bracelet on." So he stops. He looks right at me, and he says, "I have a bag full in my closet. Would you like some?" Right. So he didn't even answer. He answered a question I didn't even ask, but I was thinking, and I was overcome with emotion, and I walked away and I just sat down, and I don't do this often, but I just started crying. I said, and the thought that came to my mind is, maybe God is really present in this and actually cares about me and my family and my suffering daughter. And I've thought so much about this. I can explain that differently, but along with other things that have happened, it's nice when God shows up in ways like that every once in a while. It doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen every year. It doesn't happen every decade. The rest of life more one step at a time, moving along life and the journey and contemplating the bigger questions. But that's something to me, and I've had some other moments like that too, but not many. You know, I can't write a book about it. There are too few of them. Um,
Was
but
your daughter
I think it's fair to say I've chosen to interpret that a certain way based on other experiences and my background and things like that.
was your daughter improved since then?
Yeah, the joke is she's the healthiest one in the family right now. But she's now 29, and this was when she was 16, and she has one child and another on the way, and a wonderful husband, and she's about an hour and a half from us, so we see her a lot. But she'll probably be watching this, as far as I know. She always looks at this kind of stuff. So,
That's
but yeah,
glad
I
to
mean,
hear.
it was a story that ended well, but not without pain, not with a lot of like. It wasn't like, and we lived happily ever after that. The next 5 years were hell. It was difficult, but I could look back on that, you know, like the old hymn says, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, my rock of remembering," and I think back of that. And I say, you know, just look at the bigger picture here. Don't get caught up in your own anxiety. But you know,
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I've had
yeah,
depression issues also. Mine didn't haven't gone away yet though.
yeah. I mean, they're so epidemic almost. You know, I mean, I'm prone to anxiety. I've never been prone to depression, but I know plenty of people very close to me who are, and it's not again. I've heard too many times in the Christian world, well, are you praying enough? Okay. Or you just need to hear a better sermon. And it's, you know, no, I think what I need is medication and a really good therapist. That's going to help me a lot. And I don't think that's contradictory to the nature of God or anything like that. But we want to find quick Christian answers to everything, whether it's the universe or mental illness or and anything, and all you need is this formula, and that's how it works. And again, I think, you know, the largest of the universe and the smallest of our atoms and everything in between, it's so beautifully complex and out of our control. And I think trusting God can actually be an interesting thing at that moment, you know, because I don't know, I'm just one person living at one moment in time. What in heaven's name can I add to the conversation? And I think that's where faith comes in. And in that sense, see, for me, faith is not a crutch. I can live without faith. I can get things done. I can do things, but I do, and I can't always explain it. And it's a nice companion, you know, through life. And it's not a crutch for me because I'm not expecting it to do anything like answer these kinds of questions, like why people suffer this or that. You know, I don't get to have answers to that because nobody else has had answers to that.
There's a question that was related to this. Doug asked, like, what does Christianity add to your life? How would your life be different without it? Because you said you could live without faith.
Yeah, I mean, I did go through, I hate to say an atheist phase because it sounds rather demeaning. I don't mean it that way, but years ago where I didn't believe anything. I literally did not believe anything outside of just myself. But you know, what does it add to me? I think it adds to me a paradigm that takes me completely out of myself and locates me in a much larger thing than myself, which is rooted in goodness. And I mean, I know this, a lot of my Christian friends won't like this, but it's rooted in goodness and kindness and love to others, and a love that's modeled in a self-sacrificial way, both by the Father and the Son and by the Spirit, you know. And that's what it adds to me. It adds to me a life path that I think will make me, again, some of my Christian friends will leap out of their chairs for me putting it this way, but it will make me a better person. Now, can you be a better person without Christianity? Obviously, you can. I know plenty of people who are wonderful human beings, but I'd like to think that if God exists, maybe God is not outside of their experience either. I don't know that, but I do believe it.
And yeah, appreciate that answer. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, everything you've said so far makes complete sense to me. I totally agree with you more than any other apologist I've talked to or any other religious theologian I've talked to.
Do I get a prize or something? Are you going to send me a check?
Yeah,
Or
cookie. Send you a cookie.
what kind? How about that chair?
No. This chair is a really nice, expensive chair. $1,000 lazy boy
Your chair
chair.
reminds me of a scene from The Simpsons. I don't know if you ever watched The Simpsons, where Montgomery Burns is sitting in this big chair. If you don't watch The Simpsons, your listeners will know that. But anyway, it's this beautiful chair he sits in. So,
Yeah, thank you. I do.
but you're nothing
It's
like Montgomery Burns. So don't worry about it. He's sort of a wretched human being. So, yeah.
so I got a question from one of my followers, Jack. He asked, um, if God exists, he thinks, wouldn't it be obvious to everyone? Doesn't the fact that we need apologetics at all, isn't that an argument against God, the fact that it exists, and we don't just all are aware of God?
Yeah, I mean, I do get the question. I think that I think there are two things happening in that question. We don't need apologetics. That's sort of one of my points. You only need apologetics if your view of God is trapped in a modernist foundationalist paradigm. And I think that's fundamentally the problem with modern Western Christianity. Um, but wouldn't God be obvious to everyone? Um, I think we get in our own way in that respect. I mean, the Bible might call that sin, and that's a word that's just loaded with a lot of connotations. But um, I remember I was speaking once to a spiritual advisor a few years ago, and she asked me, "Well, what do you like to do?" And I had trouble answering that question actually, but I said, I love going in the backyard and just splitting wood. And she said, well, that should tell you something about maybe God is present even when you're doing this. I just think we've been so conditioned to be unaware of God's presence all around us all the time anyway, that we're looking for these reasons, these sort of pigeonholed kinds of moments or thoughts. If God, see, this is where Richard Rohr is helpful again. If God exists, what if God is in everything and in everyone? And we're just so conditioned to not seeing that. I think there's a time in human history, maybe a pre-scientific, maybe pre-enlightenment, maybe pre-reformation, maybe pre-renaissance and humanism and all that, where I think people they may have had less of a blockade to perceiving God's presence around them, perhaps. I do think that sort of a modern Christians have to get over the modernist paradigm. Um, Karl Rahner, he's a Roman Catholic theologian, post World War II, Vatican II, and who did a lot of thinking because of the Holocaust. He said you got to think differently about God. But he said, and forgive the sexist language, he said something like, the future Christian will be a mystic or he will be none at all. In other words, he's seeing the failings of the modern world, not for doing great things that the modern world does, but for trying to explain ultimate reality. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with, that I deal with. We're so hyper intellectualized, and for all its failings, I think intellectually, evangelicalism and fundamentalism are fundamentally intellectual enterprises. That is sort of, there's experience involved, but they style it as an intellectual endeavor. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. I do think it's faith seeking understanding, not understanding will solve your problems.
And you said
So,
you had your
yeah,
tricycle was the literature, the experience, and what was the third one?
the tricycle was scripture and tradition are the back wheels. The front wheel is your experience. Because I would like to think that God resides in our full humanity, not just in the tired thoughts that keep running through my head and out my mouth. I love my brain. I love my mouth. I love talking. I love writing. but it's about like honoring that without thinking that it explains everything. It's a facet of our humanity. And we're reminded of that when I think mental illness is a reminder of that, because you feel mental illness in your body. It's not just in your brain. It's like your whole life is just consumed with the pain. And that tells me something about the truncated way we sometimes think about the human experience, as if it's simply an intellectual exercise. It is that, but it's more than that. It's not that. It's just it's a part of it. It's almost like we have to tame a part of ourselves, even humble a part of ourselves, so we don't think that this will address, well, like you've been saying, ultimate reality. I don't think that it can. I think as soon as we think we do that, it's first of all immediately deconstructible, and also we've shown. See, that's apophatic theology. When you talk about it, and no matter what you say, you've already said the opposite, and you've made no sense. Even God is love. Okay, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by is? And what do you mean by love? And any idea we have in our head is immediately wrong, even if we're trying to apprehend something correct. So anyway, I think that answers a question you asked somewhere in there, but I really get into talking about this stuff. I appreciate the conversation
Yeah, me
because
too. I'm really enjoying
these
this.
are important things to talk about in my mind.
You mentioned that in the past people were more open to knowing God as opposed to the modern society. One of the guys in the chat asked, "Do you think that we can still get to know God through reading Scripture because it's of our cultural differences to how we used to be in the past?"
I think it's hard, but not impossible. But I think it depends on who we're talking about, because everybody's different. I wouldn't say it's a template for everybody, but again, for me, it's reading scripture that has made me more in tune to a different way of thinking about God. Not a God who's captured in the pages, but a God who can't be. Look at how contradictory it is. At Eastern University, where I teach, we have a lot of young people there, and they're not all coming from like a, oh, this is just a wonderful faith, everything makes sense. They have tons of questions, and they're coming out, for example, and they're trying to figure things out. And one student I remember, who had more or less left Christianity in her mid-teens, but came to Eastern anyway, whatever. I'm glad for that, actually. And she just couldn't stand reading the Bible, couldn't stand it. This is a young person. This isn't somebody 30 or 40, a young person. And that you have to take Bible courses at Eastern. And she took a course with one of my colleagues. And one of the things we're pointing out is essentially the contradictory nature of the Gospels. And not to slam it home, but just it's obvious you have to deal with this stuff. And her faith was actually invigorated by that. And she said, it's so nice just to see that these writers were trying to do something, and they weren't trying to do it the same way. They just, in fact, they're using each other and saying, no, I'm going to change that to say something else. And for some reason, that struck her in a way that was faith supporting and not detrimental to faith. Again, apologists might not see much sense in that story, but she apprehended something of God through that experience. So I think, yeah, that can happen to other people. It's just, it might be not that, I'm reading this Bible like a rule book, and like, I'm not getting all these things about God. It might be the utter absurdity and paradoxical nature of it that makes you just step back and say, maybe God is big and wonderful, and I've been trying to put God in this box called the Bible, and God has to fit a certain way.
Yeah, that's an
In other
interesting.
words, not in an apologetics kind of way.
Yeah. So yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely see that where people can interpret things differently, like in reading the Bible. But like if someone had similar experiences to you, but they interpreted it more in a skeptical way and said this is a reason they interpret it as a non-God kind of a thing. Do you think they're being too skeptical if they interpret it like that?
Not necessarily, because I think a lot depends on their life experience, and again, to me that's not simply an intellectual response. That's a full life response, and that for that reason I don't demean it, right? Because, well, you're just doing that because your dad beat you or something like that. Like, that's okay. That's not an argument as far as I'm concerned, but it might affect why people react the way they do to things, right? But and it's valid. In other words, none of us is an intellectual machine. I do think experience is a front wheel, and I think that has to be valued. So there's probably a point in time in my lifetime where I would have gotten into some sort of a low level debate with someone like that, but I won't anymore. I just have to respect, because I understand that. I understand why people would say that, and I just have to let that be. I think I can't. It's not my job to dehumanize their experience. It's my job to love them and to be friends with them and not to be hostile towards them, because they just can't right now. They just can't. I mean, that would, to me, that is so contradictory to the nature of the gospel itself that it's self-defeating. Okay, what if I win an argument? For now, that all he has to do is read something else and he's got a better argument than I do, right? So what's the purpose of all that?
So what is the best way you found to talk with fundamentalists in your experience, or do you just avoid them?
Um, it's very hard well, I have to allow them the space too that I would allow others, and to know that whether they realize it or not, they're actually on a journey as well, and I want to respect where they are. So I'm not going to come at them and say, "Hey, by the way, pal, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and it's contradictory, and there's stuff in the Gospels that Jesus probably didn't say or do." I'm not going to start with that, but I want to sort of let them know that I can be a safe person that they might disagree with, because the day may come when they may have questions and they may be looking for another paradigm, and I want to be there to sort of help them with that as well. So I really don't talk to, I try not to pick fights with fundamentalists. Sometimes it's hard, but I try not to. And I feel like when they're ready, they know where they can find me and we can talk about stuff. I've been invited to debates with apologists. There's no way on this earth I'm going to do that, because we're never going to get past the first sentence, because I'm going to deconstruct the whole process. Right. That's why I'm not going to do that either. I'm not going to get into it with fundamentalists, because they're not going to change their mind because I have a better argument. If they're going to ever change, it's going to have to start with an experience they've had that drives them to think about the nature of reality differently.
Yeah, it's really good. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been great, great listening and talking with you. You said you live in Pennsylvania. Where in Pennsylvania?
I live just outside of Philadelphia, north of Philadelphia, so the southeastern part. Where are you, by the way?
I'm in Minnesota, but my parents live in Pottstown, so they're kind of in your
Are
area.
you kidding me?
Yeah,
Yeah, Pottstown is about without traffic, I can get to Pottstown probably about 35 minutes from
that'd be
here.
awesome.
So
Next time I visit, I gotta come give you a call,
why
come
don't you do
down,
that?
buy a
That'd be
drink.
fantastic. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you drink beer? I hope so.
Yes, I drink lots of things.
Okay, we'll go get a beer together if you want to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
that'd be fun.
absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
well, I've got to get prepared for my next debate coming up in about 15 minutes, but I really enjoyed talking with
Okay.
you. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thanks
Same
for
here,
taking
Tom.
the time.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks to your people who are watching and listening. That's pretty cool too.
Yeah,
So
thank you, audience guys, for coming and watching as always.
yeah.
You guys are great. All right, I'm gonna get something to eat
Right.
real quick. I'll talk to you later.
See you, Tom. Yep. Take care.
Bye.